If you don't have time to watch every single tattoo tutorial video out there, this is everything that I've learned about tattooing in the last 12 years, all in one place. Starting with line work. So the first thing that you've got to do when it comes to line work is think about glide. I like to use green glide, and I put glide all over my stencil, and I put a little bit on the underside of my glove as well, so that I'm easily able to slide my hand across the skin. If you don't have any glide on your hand and you're trying to move and do a line and the skin catches, then it can just bump you and completely mess up your line. As for having green glide on the skin, it's extremely important because it lubricates the needle as it glides across the skin so that it can effortlessly deposit the ink into that correct layer of skin. On top of that, it also acts as a protection barrier for your stencil. If you have a thin layer of glide over your stencil and you get a drop of ink on it, when you go to wipe it off, it'll just come straight off. Whereas if there's no glide, then the skin will absorb it. You go to wipe it, it's going to smear and completely obscure your stencil. By the time you're able to wipe it off, you've already ripped up half of your stencil and you've barely even started yet. You just have to be careful though when you are putting it on. If you put on too much, it can actually clog your needles. This is the main reason why I like to use green glide. In the past, I've used Vaseline. It's super old school, but it's a lot thicker and it really clogs up your needles. Green glide is a lot thinner, so it doesn't clog up your needles as easily, but it can still do it if you put an excessive amount on the skin. So when you do apply the green glide to the skin, you want a nice thin layer, okay? If you can physically see this goo on the skin, you put on way too much. You need to put on a very thin layer, just a little bit, so that it's enough to lubricate the needles, but not so much that it clogs them up. Up next, we've got 3 points of contact. So when you're lining, stability is key. I see a lot of new tattoo artists, they line and their hand is so unstable, they're constantly shaking, they're constantly wobbling, and it just prevents them from ever doing a straight line. Something that's really going to help with that and increase that stability is having 3 points of contact. Now, this is more of a beginner tactic. As you get more and more advanced, you'll need to do this less and less and less, and you'll be able to just glide your hand over the skin. But in the beginning, when your hands are weak and you don't have the strength built up, this is gonna help a lot. When you line, if I'm tattooing a back piece, like a person is sitting vertically, I like to make sure that my elbow is locked against my ribs, my wrist is planted on their skin, and then I'll also have the pinky finger of my tattooing hand in contact with the thumb of my stretching hand. So when I'm pulling a line towards myself, I'm moving my hand down and I'm pushing my thumb backwards, so I'm still maintaining the stretch. Every single contact point that you have is going to increase your stability and make it easier for you to get a clean, solid, fluid line. Another thing that I like to do is, like when I'm tattooing, I make sure that the fleshy part of my palm is against the skin, and then I take my bottom 2 fingers and then I also roll those onto the skin. So I have like a triangle base of support. I have as much contact with the skin as I can, which gives me a massive base, prevents me from wobbling and shaking around, and makes my lines a hell of a lot cleaner. Now, you're not always going to be able to pull a line towards yourself like this. Sometimes you'll have to go from different positions. When I'm tattooing vertically, I'll use like a pistol grip, and then horizontally, it's like devil horns. And then I'll put my 2 fingers on my index finger, and then I will drag the machine backwards, pulling it back, maintaining the stretch, all while having that really strong base of support because I have so many contact points. My hand doesn't have any room to shake. Having all of these anchor points is massively going to improve our stability and make it a lot easier. It's going to make you feel a lot more comfortable while you're tattooing, so you're not going to be shaking all over the place. Now that we've got your stability under control, the next thing we're going to look at is stretching the skin. When you're tattooing, you're going to be moving in all different directions, especially with line work. When you're lining, stretching the skin is critical. Shading is a little bit more forgiving, but line work, you absolutely need to get it right, because if you don't, you'll never get clean lines. When you're stretching the skin, you always want to make sure that you stretch along the line. If I have a line going sideways and I stretch vertically, as soon as I finish that line, it might go in, but as soon as I let go of that stretch, it's going to be all squiggly, it's going to be busted, it's going to be terrible. Stretch along the line that you're tattooing or along the direction that you're moving. Going back to my 3 points of contact, if I'm moving a line that's directly vertical, give me a 3-point stretch. I will have like a pistol grip, so I'll stretch from my thumb and also my index and middle finger, but I'll also pull back with my palm. I'll put my pinky and ring finger in contact with the thumb, and then I will pull the line down towards myself. As I'm going down, I will move my thumb backwards with my pinky and ring finger so that we'll maintain the stretch, but I've constantly got that contact, which is going to make me really, really stable. Also, the tighter the skin is, the less you're going to need to stretch it. If you're tattooing someone's shin versus their stomach, you're not going to really need to stretch the shin a whole lot because the skin is already super tight, as opposed to the stomach where the skin is really loose. When it gets close to joints, the skin around joints is naturally more tough, and it's also more stretchy because it's constantly moving. You will need to stretch the skin a bit more in those areas. If you can get the client to stretch their own skin by positioning them correctly, for example, the back of the shoulder is typically a very difficult place to tattoo. However, if you get them to put their hand on their shoulder and then move their elbow up over to the side, it will massively stretch out that entire area and it makes it a lot easier to tattoo. Another thing that you can also do is a 4-point stretch. Okay, so this is for like those really stretchy areas like the stomach and like the lower back that just really need like that extra bit of tension. If you put your palm of your stretching hand on the skin, you move back and then you do a pistol grip. So then you've got a 3-point stretch. You can also pull back with your tattooing hand and then move within that 4-point stretch. You've got a really tight area to tattoo. Just be careful because if you move your tattooing hand towards your other hand, you're going to lose that stretch. So you can only move backwards as you're going with your tattooing hand. Now, when you are stretching the skin, you don't have to apply a ton of pressure and rip the person's skin in half. It only takes a little bit just to put enough tension on the skin. And even though on fake skin, you don't really need to do it, it's still great to practice because when you start tattooing on actual people, if you build these habits now, it's gonna make it a lot easier when you start doing it for real on human clients. Once you've got a good stretch when you're tattooing, the next thing we wanna look at is the angle of your machine. When you tattoo at an angle, the penetration point where the needle hits the skin versus the end point where the needle is at the bottom of the stroke, there's a distance between those two. The end point is in front of the entry point. And when you move the machine across the skin, all of those entry and end points are overlapping on top of each other, and ink is deposited all throughout that penetration path. When multiple penetration paths are overlapping over each other, the line appears more saturated and it's much easier to get a darker, saturated line. So when you tattoo at an angle, you'll notice that it's easier to get solid black lines and you can move a bit quicker because all of those penetration paths are overlapping on top of each other, which makes the line appear darker. This is great for smaller needles, but as you start using thicker and bigger needles, you can't actually have a massive angle because what happens then is that not all of the sharps penetrate the skin. So in order to use like an 11 or a 14 or an 18 round liner, you have to increase that angle to the point where it's almost 90 degrees in order for all of the sharps to enter the skin at an even depth to get a crisp, solid, even line. When this happens, you have to move a lot slower because instead of having those overlapping penetration paths, you now just have individual dots that are going next to each other. So in order to get a solid saturated line, you need to give the machine more time to put more dots next to each other so that it appears to be solid and black. On top of that, when you are using a bigger needle, because you have to move slower, some people will crank up the voltage in order to compensate for that to try and move at the same speed. I wouldn't recommend doing that. Bigger needles, you do have to move a bit slower than with smaller needles so that it has enough time to penetrate and saturate the skin. You can turn it up a little bit, but not a lot. I'm talking like half a volt, but you just want to mainly move slower to compensate for that so that it has enough time to penetrate the skin, get a solid line without blowing it out, without overworking the person's skin. Up next, let's take a look at how to actually hold your machine. So when I hold the tattoo machine, I have it at an angle. It rests on top of my knuckle here, and the shoulder of the machine and the base of the cartridge is on top of my middle finger, and then my middle finger is resting on top of my bottom 2 fingers. Now what that does is it prevents me from going too deep because the machine is resting on my middle finger and my middle finger is resting on my pinky and ring finger. There's a limit to how far down I can push the machine. That's like a guard on a pair of clippers, right? As when you're moving, it just prevents you from going too deep and you just slide across the skin. All I'm focusing on is just moving my hand in a clean motion. And by having that guard that prevents me from going too deep, I don't even have to think about my depth. When I'm holding my machine like this is typically if I'm doing anything that's diagonal or anything that's vertical. Now it changes up a little bit if I'm going horizontal. If I have to move horizontally, the machine moves back into the crease between my thumb and my index finger, but it still rests on my middle finger, which rests on my pinky and ring finger. It just means that the machine goes from here when I'm going horizontal, whereas if I'm going vertical, I move that machine across and then it rests on my index finger instead of the crease between my thumb and my index finger. It's very important that you know how to hold your machine in more than just one position because there's going to be times throughout the tattoo where you're not able to hit that perfect angle that you feel super comfortable with and you have to get a line in an awkward direction. If you're able to hold your machine in 2 different ways and you can hit any line from any direction, then you're always going to feel comfortable doing it, which means your lines are going to come out much, much cleaner. Moving on, let's take a look at the different ways that you can move based on the length of the line that you're tattooing. So if you're doing a really small line, something that's smaller than the size of your fingernail, you can be a lot more precise by just keeping everything super, super still and then just very slightly moving with your fingers. For really small, intricate stuff, the movement generally comes from your fingers. However, if you're doing really, really long lines and a lot of bigger tattoos, or you just got a lot of straight line work that goes over a long distance, in order to get that super clean and super steady, you want to pretend like you're your hand is a piece of stone. You don't want to move your fingers. You don't want to move your wrist. You want to lock everything in place and then pull from your lat, like as if you're doing a row, and just drag your entire arm back and keep everything super, super still. That's going to help you stay really steady for those longer lines so you can get them nice and crisp. Next up, let's take a look at your needle depth. Okay, this is one of the most common challenges of new tattoo artists when they're just getting into this. When it comes to your needle depth, if you hold the machine the way that I showed you before, where it uses your fingers as like a guard that prevents you from going too deep, you don't need to do what's called riding the tube. Riding the tube is where you reduce the needle depth so that the cartridge goes all the way to the skin, and you use that as the guard that prevents you from going too deep instead of your fingers, and that's what allows you to get those clean, straight lines without having to worry about going too deep. Now, does this work? Technically, yes, it does. You can tattoo tube to skin. However, you're going to get a lot of ink dumping all over your stencil because the reservoir inside of the cartridge is directly connected to the skin via the needle that's going up and down. So it's going to spit out ink everywhere and you're going to lose visibility. So what you gain in depth control, you lose in visibility. So when you're thinking about what depth to set your machine at when you're doing your line work, it's a constant trade-off between visibility and ink flow. The more depth that you have, the greater your visibility will be and the less ink that's going to spin on the skin, but the less ink flow that you're going to have, which means it's going to be harder for the needle to deposit ink into the skin. Now for line work, this is actually a good thing because you don't want a whole lot of ink to go into the skin. When you have reduced ink flow, you only see a tiny little dot of ink when you're tattooing that's just the exact same size as the stencil, and it allows you to very easy follow it, getting a nice, clean, straight line. However, when you reduce the depth and you've got lots and lots of ink flow, the ink just spits out, it covers, you can't see what you're doing, and effectively you're tattooing blind. Does this mean that you should never ride the tube? Not necessarily. Having less depth with your machine is a lot better when it comes to shading and color work because you want a high level of ink flow. You want to saturate the skin full of ink. You're trying to put a lot in when you're using a big mag needle. So then it makes a lot more sense. Plus, when you are using a mag, it's a lot more forgiving than when you're doing a line. So the accuracy isn't quite as important. It still matters, but it's not as important as when you're trying to do really fine line, delicate Chicano script, as opposed to when you're doing a realistic black and gray piece. Also, when you're using bigger liners, having more ink flow is going to help you get a more saturated, clean line. So when I use, 11s, 14s, and 18s, I'll actually reduce my depth quite a bit compared to if I was doing like a 3-liner or a 7-liner. I'll reduce the depth so that my machine is almost going tube to skin. It doesn't quite go there, but it's a lot lower and I do have less visibility, more ink dumps out on the skin. But when you're doing really thick lines, it doesn't matter as much. What's more important is that you want to get the flow and the direction of the line that it's going as opposed to staying directly on the stencil. Thicker needles feel like they grip the skin a bit more. It's easier to keep them nice and steady, but it's harder to get them saturated and dark, the lines, because it's a lot harder for them to penetrate the skin because there's more sharps. So having increased ink flow by reducing the depth is going to help with that. So I strongly recommend when you're doing line work to float the needle, hang the needle out a little bit further, especially with those smaller liners so that you have a lot more visibility. Sometimes in the beginning, people will ride the tube because it's just one less thing to worry about. And it does work, but again, it's just gonna make it hard if you do very precision-based work, which is what a lot of walk-ins are going to be. A lot of script, a lot of symbols require very precise line work. When it comes to how deep should the needle actually go into the skin when you're tattooing it, you wanna go for the 1 to 2 millimeter mark, which is where the dermis is. If you go too shallow, what you'll see is an opaque or almost like a gray line, and it won't be completely black. And on top of that, it's going to fade when it heals because anything that's in the epidermis or the first layer of the skin, that layer of skin is constantly getting renewed and falling off. So it's going to fade a lot quicker if it's in the top layer of the skin. Now, if you go too deep, on the other hand, you're going to see it blow out. If you get down to the fatty layer of the skin that's beneath the dermis, that's when the ink massively expands. The size of your lines is going to dramatically increase. You're going to lose any details. It's just going to all turn into like a nasty looking blob. The severity of the blowout will vary between person to person. Typically, if someone's a bit older, blowouts are going to look a lot worse. You really want to make sure that you're hitting that second layer of skin so that it doesn't fall out and that it doesn't blow out, get super thick, cause scar tissue. You have to also remember as well that different parts of the body are going to have different thicknesses when it comes to the skin. For example, your kneecap is going to be a lot thicker than the side of your neck because obviously it's around a joint, it needs to be stronger, it's constantly stretching and moving, and typically it just takes a lot more wear and tear throughout your day-to-day life. Your knees are constantly bumping into things, so naturally the skin is thicker than the more delicate parts of your body. Typically, whichever parts of the body that are naturally protected by your anatomy, so for example, the side of your neck, your ribs, your inner thighs, also anything that's bony. If you're tattooing a shin, anything that's close to like a bone, skin, it's going to be very thin there as well. Like a collarbone is another perfect example of that. When you do hit that right depth, when you're hitting the dermis, when you're tattooing, you're going to feel a vibration in your stretching hand. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't exist when you're tattooing fake skin. You're not really going to feel that. But when you start tattooing people, it's very subtle, but if you look for it and as you become more and more experienced and more confident with your tattooing, you will start to feel a vibration in your stretching hand when you're going the right depth. It's hard to describe what that feels like, but as soon as it happens, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So be aware, and once you feel that tension and that resistance and that subtle vibration in your stretching hand, you know that you're hitting that second layer of the skin. Also, as we age, the skin gets thinner too. So old people are gonna have much thinner skin than younger people. So you have to be a little bit more delicate. There's some needles that you just can't use on people that are at a certain age. Like once people get past 70, you're not really gonna wanna use a 14 liner on them because it's just gonna tear them to pieces. So when you're selecting your needle depth, if you want to float the needle, which is what I recommend, you have to make sure though that you have a long enough stroke of machine to support the amount of needle hang that you have. If you have a really short stroke machine, say a 3mm stroke machine, which is a short stroke, and you hang the needle out too far, it's not going to fully retract into the cartridge at the bottom of the cycle. If it doesn't fully retract into the cartridge, it's not going to hit the ink reservoir, which is at the back of the cartridge or towards the base of the tip, and you're gonna have massive problems with ink flow, okay? You could do everything else right, but if the needle hasn't got any ink inside of the sharps, then it's not going to put any ink inside of the skin. Now this leads me to talking about machine stroke, okay? Machine stroke is simply just the distance that the needle travels in each up and down cycle. For line work, I strongly recommend a 4 to 5mm stroke machine. This means that the needle has enough wind back or enough pull, hits the skin with enough force so that it's able to penetrate it easily and put in nice, solid, crisp black lines. But in addition to that, you can hang the needle out far enough to float it while it still retracts fully into the cartridge so you get nice, clean saturation when you're doing your line work. You do have to be careful with this though, because if you use a longer stroke machine, I'm talking about a 5mm, you have to actually hang the needle out quite a bit, because if you pull it in too far, there's not enough space for the drive bar to move up and down during each cycle, because you're shortening that distance every time that you twist, grip, and pull that needle cartridge in further and further and further. You'll hear it, it'll make like a grinding sound. This is a normal sound. It's a 5mm stroke, humming along beautifully. Now if I shorten the depth, you can hear straight away that's making that grinding sound. That's because I'm pulling the needle in too far for the machine to be able to hit it effectively. Something you've got to be on the lookout for as well with a 5mm stroke machine, because it is significantly more powerful, it is very easy to overwork the skin. The needle hits the skin with a lot of velocity because it has so much space to wind back, but you don't have a whole lot of margin for error. If you keep going over the same spots again and again and again, it's going to rip it up very quickly, which is why if you're just starting out, 5mm stroke machine is a bit of a jump. Start with a 4.2, it's a lot more beginner friendly. The next thing we want to take a look at is machine give. Both pen machines and rotary machines do not have any give. The needle will keep moving along its up and down cycle. Even if you go too deep, it's just going to crunch through the skin. They are quite unforgiving machines in that circumstance. The machine will not back off like a coil machine does, so it is actually easier to overwork the skin with a rotary or a pen machine than it is with a coil machine. That said, despite that, pen and rotary machines are still a lot easier to use once you get the hang of them. Now, there are some rotary machines that have modified tension bars that actually give the machine a bit of a give and a bit of a softer hit. For example, the Injector Nano, also the Injector V2 Flight. This was my second machine that I ever had when I started tattooing. They have these tension bars, right? You can adjust them, you can put them onto the machine. They've got like a soft, medium, and hard tension bar. Now, the purpose of these tension bars is to give the machine a softer hit and somewhat mimic the coil, how it backs off if you go a little bit too hard, and just make the machine a lot more delicate on the skin. In the beginning, when I first started tattooing, I used to really like this. However, I don't use these machines anymore. The reason being is that machine has give and it backs off a little bit. It makes it a lot harder to saturate the skin, especially when you're doing line work. It's terrible for line work. I much prefer a hard hitting machine that allows me to get those lines packed into the skin so that they're nice and saturated, as opposed to a machine that backs off and then it gives me kind of a half saturated opaque line. Next up, let's talk about movement. One habit that you want to avoid is constantly moving the fake skin around so that it's in that perfect position so you can pull a line that one way that you like doing it. It's not always going to be possible when you're tattooing a client. You can't snap their arm and just move it into an impossible position. So it's important to learn how to move when you're doing your lines in multiple different ways. I talked about this a little bit before, but when I'm coming towards myself, I will hold my machine against my middle finger, then I'll slide the machine towards myself. If I'm going diagonally, I'll actually slide the machine backwards, or if I'm going sideways, drag the machine backwards, and I'll move that machine between my thumb and my index finger instead of having it resting on my knuckle. This just allows me to hit a lot more different angles from being in the same spot. And even if I can't hit that same spot, there's nothing wrong with moving your arm or moving your body so that you can get a better position when you are lining. If you stay in the same spot all the time when you're tattooing, sometimes you're going to be forced to line in a position that you may not be comfortable with, and that's going to make the line come out terrible. If you are not comfortable when you're pulling a line, it's not going to come out good. You can even get the client to slightly rotate their leg. Don't be afraid to speak up and tell the client to move. You just want to avoid the habit of constantly having that one movement that you can do and then moving the skin around so that you can always hit it from that same angle. It's not going to teach you how to line effectively. Now we're going to cover the angle of the machine while you're lining. This is really, really important because if you have the machine angled the wrong way, you could do everything else correctly and you're not going to get solid lines. When you are tattooing, super important to ensure that the machine is angled in the same direction that the line is going. So I have a line that's going straight. I want to make sure that the machine is angled along that line. If I have a line that's going horizontal, I want to make sure the machine is angled across that line. If you move the machine sideways along a line, you're going to get what's called blowouts. You'll have a clean, crisp, sharp edge on one side of the line, and on the other side it'll be all fuzzy. It's going to massively expand. The line's going to get dramatically thicker, and it's going to look absolutely terrible. With that said, there is a tiny bit of leeway, all right? So if you're tattooing a line and it's going straight, and you're maybe 10 degrees off to the left or 10 degrees off to the right, it's still going to be okay. You're not going to get massive blowouts for that. It's more of a problem when you're lining at 90 degrees. There's a line that's going vertically and then you're holding the machine horizontally and then you move down that line, then it's going to be absolutely busted. But a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right is just fine. And it's actually very useful for when you're tattooing curved lines where the direction of the line is going to change. So if you're tattooing a curved shape, having the machine at a slight angle allows for both when the line is going straight all around the curve, and then when it starts going to the left or to the right, it allows you to be in a good position for the entire direction of the line because you had the machine off a little bit towards of an angle so that when you change directions, it was still in the right place. Now we've covered a lot of theory when it comes to line work. Now let's take a little bit of a look at what happens when the needle actually hits the skin. So when you're pulling lines, one of the first things that you're going to need to work out is tapering, both in and out. What that means is when you're tattooing along the skin, if you suddenly pull the needle out of the skin without tapering it out gradually, you're going to be left with a really fat, thick ending for your line, which means it's going to be very difficult to join and get it to look seamless like it was done in a single pass. This is going to make your work look sloppy and unclean. When you are starting a line, you want to slowly taper into the skin. You don't want to just stick the needle in and then move it across and then yank it out. You want to glide the needle into the skin, moving across, and then gradually glide it out so you get a sharp taper on both ends. The start and the ending of your line should be a sharp point as opposed to a fat, chunky stop. When you're starting out, even if you do taper your lines in and out, it is still difficult to get your lines to join together seamlessly to make them look like they were done in a single pass. So another thing that you can do to make that even easier is only start and end your lines when they intersect with another line. If you just pick a straight line that doesn't join with anything and then you try and do it in more than one pass, it's quite difficult to get them to match up. But when there's another line that intersects, it makes it a lot easier and it hides the fact that you've joined them together a lot better than if it's just a clean straight line. When it comes to tattooing corners, it makes more sense to tattoo these in 2 passes instead of 1, because when your lines come to an edge, if you taper them out, it'll be nice and sharp. But if you try to keep going and you do it in a single pass, the angle of the machine is not going to be matching the new direction of the line, and it's going to be very easy for you to get blowouts. Next thing we want to look at is the stencil, right? When it comes to following the stencil with your needle, there is some leeway depending on what you're tattooing. Some types of tattoos, for example, script, mandalas, sacred geometry, precision is the most important thing. There is no room for error. You must get the line exactly as the stencil is on the skin, otherwise the tattoo is going to look completely busted. However, there are some types of designs which are a lot more beginner friendly, and I highly recommend that you start doing if you're new to this, that have a bit more leeway. For example, skulls, flames, water, rocks, anything with an organic bumpy edge. Roses are amazing for this. The leaves on the roses can be almost any shape. During this part of the process, it's much more important that you follow the gesture of the line, that the hand moves in the same flow of the stencil. Even if you go off a little bit of the stencil, don't try and correct it. Just keep going so the line stays clean and then come back onto the stencil gradually clearly. So then that way it looks like it was intentional. Once the stencil rubs off at the very end of the tattoo, it won't look like there's a mistake. It'll look like a perfectly executed line. However, if you go off the stencil and you quickly try to go back on, it's going to be very obvious that you fucked it up. It's going to show in the final tattoo and you're not going to be able to fix it. So with that in mind, regardless of whether you're doing a piece of script that needs to be absolutely perfect or you're doing something like a rose or a skull, which gives you a little bit of leeway, it's best practice to taper out of the skin when you start to feel uncomfortable. You can't line forever. If you keep going, you keep moving your hand, eventually it's going to get to a point where it's not comfortable. And at that point, it's much better to taper out and then move your hand positioning and start the process again and keep that line going throughout the piece. If you want to check out techniques like these in action and ask questions, then you definitely want to check out our full Artist Accelerator program. Links in the description down below. Each week, myself, Jay, and Brandon do live calls and answer all of your questions and dive deeper into building a tattooing career, including taking a closer look at techniques just like this. Next up, let's dive into voltage. One of the most common questions that I get from people that are just starting out in tattooing is what voltage should I have my machine on? And unfortunately, there's no one magic number that I can give you because it depends on a few different things. The first one is how fast you move your hand. If you move extremely quickly when you're lining, you'll need more voltage because the machine doesn't have as much time to hit the skin enough times to put in a fully saturated line. If you move your hand slowly and you have a really high voltage, then it means that you're going to just hack the skin up. On top of that, you have to consider the type of needle that you're using. So a small needle needs less voltage than a big needle because a small needle has less resistance when it's trying to enter the skin compared to a large needle like a 14 or an 18 round liner, which has a lot more surface tension that it needs to break through. This is further impacted by if you're using a bug pin or a long taper needle. The longer the taper on the needle, the more sharp it is, the easier it is to be able to penetrate the skin. Also, bug pin needles are thinner, therefore again, less surface tension to break through. Now this might sound like a lot, but individually, each one of these don't impact the voltage of your machine much. It's mostly your hand speed that's going to affect your voltage. Now when it comes to lining with a round shader, personally, I don't really like to line with round shaders. If I want a thicker needle, I'll just use a bigger liner. The difference is going to be negligible and it's not really going to impact your tattooing if you use the same voltage for a 7 round liner or a 7 round shader. That said though, a round shader can be helpful when you're lining if you want to thicken up your lines. So if you're doing like really chunky fat power lines, you can do your line work as normal with a liner needle and then you can come back and thicken up those lines by packing ink into next to that line with a round shader. You can also do this with a 5 or a 7 mag, but you're going to get really thick, chunky, fat lines, and this is better reserved for massive pieces like sleeves, back pieces, or new school stuff where you need a really massive variance in line weights. The main thing that I do use round shaders for though is creating texture and shading really small, tight areas that I can't reach with a mag. Which brings us to packing color and shading with mag needles. So when using a Magnum needle, you've basically got two choices. You've got straight mag or you've got curved mag. There are other types like flats, but not many people really use those. Now, me personally, I use curved mags for everything. There's nothing, in my opinion, that a straight mag can do that a curved mag can't do better. They're a lot easier on the skin. They can do things that straight mags can't do, so I use them for every tattoo that I do. I do not use straight mags at all. Because the curved mags have a feathered edge, so they curve like a C shape, they cause a lot less trauma to the skin. The shape of the Magnum needle is much more natural when you put it onto the skin. It naturally dips and divots in the shape of the needle, which means the corners of the needle aren't tearing up the skin. I can use the corners of a curved mag. It's naturally going to have a nice feathered edge, which is going to allow me to get into really tight spots and get a nice fade on the other side, all without cutting up and overworking the skin. So really useful, versatile needle that you can use. So when we're putting large amounts of ink into the skin, we're going to want to use a packing technique. The main one to saturate the skin very quickly was really tight circular ovals. When you put the mag on the skin, you want to have it at a slight angle, like around a 45-degree angle, and then just move up and down, but not directly up and down. You want to move in an oval shape. The reason why you want to have your needles on an angle is because if you have them perfectly flat, when you move to the side, all of the needles will line up and slice the skin. If I'm using a 23 curved mag and I move directly side to side, that's 23 needles that are going over the same spot. By having the machine on a 45-degree angle, it doesn't matter if you move left, right, up or down, all the needles in the cartridge never line up. Plus, when you have the machine at an angle, the gaps between the needles are closer together, which means it's going to get a more dark darker saturation in the skin. You're not going to see a big gap between the needle marks. Now, when it comes to the machine settings that you want to use when you're packing solid fills into the skin, I like using a 4.2mm stroke. You can use a 5. However, I find that with the 5mm stroke, there's a limit to how far I can pull the needles in. Otherwise, I start to get that grindy kind of sound with my machine, and it's not good for it. So I like using a 4.2mm stroke. It allows me to reduce my depth, gives me still enough power to really penetrate the skin even with larger needle groupings, and still gives really good ink flow because I'm able to pull my needles in. Now, when you're using a mag, sometimes you're not going to want to fully saturate the skin. Maybe you're blending one color from another, or you're fading out one color in a skin tone. For that, whip shading makes a lot more sense, especially when you're doing bold styles like traditional or neo-traditional. Now, the way that whip shading works is you want to put the needles into the skin and then push them forward and then gradually glide them out. At the start of the motion, the needles are fully in, and then as you move the needles and it swings out of the skin, less and less ink is deposited, which gives it that nice little fade. The thing that you want to avoid is using the shovel technique, is where you stick the needle in the skin and try and scoop the needle out. This is not going to give you nice, smooth fades, okay? This is going to hack up the skin really, really bad. When you are whip shading and you want to get it super smooth, cross hatching is what you need. So after you've just done all of your whip shading out in a single direction, you want to go back over it with a second pass and move in a different direction. What this does is it makes the needles hit different spots on that second pass that you missed the first time through. If you just keep going over the shading in the same direction and moving your machine in the same motion, the needles are going to continue to hit the same spots, which will cause more trauma and not really get you any additional saturation. When you crosshatch, it gets you lots and lots of saturation with minimal trauma, and it's going to allow you to get nice, smooth fades, and it hides those needle marks. The needle marks are from the machine when it's going up and down and hitting the skin, and if the voltage is low and your hand speed is quite fast, you'll see a large separation in between the groups of dots each time the mag hits the skin. However, when you crosshatch and you go in a different direction, this hides those needle marks and it makes it appear a lot smoother. If you're doing black and gray, then I definitely recommend using bug pins. The individual sharps are thinner and it's going to deposit less ink into the skin, which means less pronounced needle marks, which means it's going to be much, much smoother. Plus, they cause less trauma, so you can do more layers, which gives you more chances to even out those fades as you do your shading. On the flip side of that, if you're doing color work, it's much more helpful to use 12 gauge needles because they put more ink into the skin. Color is generally a thicker pigment and harder to put into the skin than black and gray or gray wash. So having those thicker needles allows you to punch more ink into the skin. Now, when you're whip shading, if your voltage is too low, then your whip shading is going to look patchy. The space between each one of your needle marks is going to be greater because the machine is hitting the skin less times. And if you've combined that with a fast movement, you're going to have massive gaps between each time the needle is hitting the skin. On top of that, if you have too low of a voltage when you're doing whip shading, sometimes it'll feel like you're catching the skin. When you slightly bump the voltage up a little bit, it's able to effortlessly glide through the skin. The needle marks are close together and you get much, much smoother blends and fades. When you're whip shading, it's important to do it in a clean, smooth motion. If you pause, you're going to deposit a lot more ink in that one particular spot, which is going to give you an obvious step in your shading, and it's going to ruin the faded blend effect. When it comes to how many passes you want to make over the skin, depends on how heavy you go. If you stick your needles right in there and you get in super hard and super deep, you can tear up the skin in 1 or 2 passes. But if you're gentle and you go across it gradually, you can build it up and do more and more and more. When I'm whip shading, I like to start off really, really light and build it up and gradually get more deeper as I get a bit of a feel for the skin and how it's reacting to the needle. Remember, you can always put more ink into the skin, but you cannot take it away once you've already put it in there. Start light and gradually build up speed and pressure as you're moving through. Now, when you get more advanced with your whip shading, you can not only arc out of the skin, but you can also arc back into the skin, which is going to allow you to saturate the skin faster. And moving the skin backwards is also a separate technique that you can use for whip shading in difficult to reach areas where you can't push the machine forward. When you push them forward, the cartridge prevents them from going backwards and they're forced into the skin and it just crunches in that ink. As you move the machine backwards, it's much more gentle on the skin. It's harder for the machine to go super, super deep into the skin. This is a really good technique for realism, or whenever you want to put tiny, small amounts of tone to just gradually build something up in a really delicate or tight area. Another technique that you absolutely need to know is pendulum shading. So what pendulum shading is, it's very similar to whip shading, but instead of just going in one direction, it goes in both. So the machine sits on an axis and it swings back and forth, going in and out of the skin, leaving creating a soft edge on both sides as opposed to a hard edge going out to a soft edge. Pendulum shading is really useful when you want like a dark spot with no hard edges around it. You want a soft fade in all directions. When you're pendulum shading, it's important to keep the needle parallel to the skin so that you get an even application of the ink with each stroke of the machine. However, if you tilt the machine to one side, you can get a much darker saturation on one side of the needle and a lighter fade on the other side of the needle. This is really good when you need a hard edge that's going out to a soft fade. Now, if you're doing black and gray and you're doing a lot of pendulum shading, a 3.5mm stroke is most optimal for doing that, as it allows you to be a lot more gentle with the skin. It's not going to cause as much trauma as quickly as a 4-stroke or a 5-stroke. That said, you can still use a 4mm stroke if you're careful when you're doing black and gray pendulum shading on the skin. If you're working with color and you're doing a lot of pendulum shading and design, then you want to have a 4.2 stroke machine, because that's going to allow you to get that color in a lot easier. With a shorter stroke machine, the needle hits the skin with a lot less velocity. So if you're using larger mags, like a 23 or a 27, it is going to have a bit of trouble to push that needle into the skin, which is why I recommend using a 4.2mm stroke for not only black and gray, but also color as well. You just need to be a little bit more gentle when you're working with black and gray, but it can do it. The same pendulum motion that you do with the mag also works when you're stippling with a small liner. It's the same technique. You're just swinging in and out of the skin, but instead of using a mag, you would use a 3-liner or potentially a 5-liner if you want the dots to be a lot more bigger and a lot more textured. However, if you want to do dot work, then you're going to be putting individual dots into skin as opposed to just using the pendulum motion to brush the liner needle in and out of the skin. Dot work isn't going to be as smooth, and the dots are going to be a lot bigger, and it's also going to be a lot slower to tattoo. Stippling, on the other hand, you can do it much faster. You're going to get a lot smoother, and it's great for also creating texture if you're doing realism. When you're using the pendulum shading with stippling, the more passes that you do over an area, assuming that you're cross-hatching it, the darker it's going to get. If you're doing dot work, then the closer together and the more dots that you pack into a smaller area, that's how you're going to control the value and how dark or light something is. In the beginning, you might prefer to shade using the stippling method rather than a mag, because it's a lot more precise and a lot easier to control than a big clunky mag needle. A common problem that beginners often come up against when they're shading, especially with a mag, they struggle to get a shading all the way up to the very edge of the line because they're worried about going over the edges. The problem is that they're judging the distance by the thickness of the cartridge, not where the needle actually is within that cartridge. When you look at a mag needle, the needle is actually about 0.5 mil inward from the edge of the plastic cartridge. So when you're actually bringing your shading all the way to a line, you want to put the mag slightly over the line, because that's where the start of the needle is going to be, and you're not going to have any gaps between where the line starts and where the shading begins. That said, if you still stuff it up and you put a bunch of shading and there's a gap between that and where the line starts, it's a very easy fix. You just put the mag on an angle, use the very corners of the mag, and you lightly brush it over the skin, very, very lightly. And what you'll see is tiny little dot marks where those needles are grazing on the skin. Once you see those line up with your line, that's when you sink it into the full depth and you just brush that needle back and forth using the corners to get a very dark edge between the line and where the shading starts. And because you're using the edge of a curved magnum, you're going to get less trauma on the other edge of the mag, because half of those needles aren't even in the skin as the mag curves upwards. Now, when you're doing black and gray tattoos, when you want to go from black all the way to skin tone, you can whip out your black ink, but it's still not going to be perfectly smooth. You're going to see a lot of needle marks, even if you cross-hatch it. So at that point, you want to use Graywash. So what you can do with Graywash is that once you've whipped out your black, you can put that over that section that you've half saturated by whipping it out, and repeat that process until you get to your lighter shade, which will blend seamlessly into skin tone. Now, the way that I like to do blends when I'm doing Graywash is that I'll whip out my black and going back and forth, fading that out as smooth as I can to skin tone. And the section that I've faded out is not going to be fully saturated. Okay, you're going to see needle marks, you're going to see bits of skin tone that is poking through. That's where you want to start the base of your pendulum shading when you're doing the next wash. So then that way the skin will be half saturated with black plus the next wash down. And then when you whip out that wash, it'll be blended from black into the wash. And then that wash will be blended out. You put the next one over the top of the section that you've just faded out. Continue that process until you get to your lightest wash and the blend fades out perfectly to skin tone. When I'm working with color, I use the exact same technique. When I'm blending, I just start with a darker color. I pendulum shade that in, or I whip out a faded out edge, and over the section of skin where the ink is whipped out, that's where I put the next pigment that I'm going to be using and blend it in with the color that I've just done. You just have to remember though, you want to do all of your dark colors first. If you wipe like a dark brown over a yellow with your paper towel, a small amount of that brown ink is going to go into the yellow and it will stain it. It's not just when the tattoo is fresh, even when that heals, there'll still be like a brown stain on that yellow. So what you want to do when you're tattooing with colors, do all your dark colors first. For followed by all your midtones, followed by all of your light tones. And also when you're wiping, you want to make sure that you wipe away from the tattoo as opposed to over an area that you've just tattooed. If you use Green Glide and put a thin layer over the entire piece, it acts as a layer of protection. If you accidentally get a drop of ink on a part you've already tattooed, and you'll easily be able to wipe that off and it won't seep into the skin and tint the color. This is why it's so important to save your white highlights for the very end of the tattoo, because white is such a bright pigment. Literally any color is going to stain it. I use a round shader rather than a mag when I'm putting in highlights, just because the round shaders are able to pack in really small concentrated areas a lot more effectively than mags. And white is a color that very easily fades. You want to make sure that it's really in there. You also want to be very tight and controlled with it, because if you go over a part that you've already tattooed, after like, 4 or 5 hour session, it's very easy to overwork it. So by using a round shader, you're very precise. It packs a very large amount of ink into a small area, whereas a mag, it's a little bit more difficult to control if you need to do something extremely precise, like fine white highlights. Another thing that you've got to look out for when you're doing color is making sure that you're dipping frequently enough. When you're tattooing someone that's causing a lot of trauma, if they start to bleed, it can dilute the colored ink and make you think that you have a lot more ink in the cartridge than what you actually do. So when you tattoo that into the skin, it will look solid when you first do it, but then it's going to fade very, very quickly and potentially heal patchy as well. When your ink is diluted with blood, you're just causing trauma to the skin. You're not packing solid saturations into the skin. You're not getting solid fills, and you potentially may have to go over it again, which dramatically increases the risk of overworking it, creating scar tissue and excessive scabbing, which can make parts of the color fall out during the healing process. Now, when you are packing color or shading or even lining in the skin as well, you also want to make sure that your paper towel is constantly being held in your stretching hand, as opposed to just having it off to the side and then grabbing it just when you need it to wipe the skin. If you don't constantly have your paper towel in your stretching hand, then it's just going to massively slow you down when you're tattooing. Also, when you are tattooing with your paper towel, you want to make sure that you dab the ink first to get most of the ink sucked up into the paper towel, and then wipe away any excess. If you just wipe straight away, the ink is going to smear, it's not going to lift up. And then if it goes over the stencil and you have to wipe it again to see the stencil underneath, every time that you wipe over that stencil, you're going to be pulling more and more off the stencil. What happens is you get to a point halfway through the tattoo, and if you're doing a portrait or something like that, the nose disappears, and it is the scariest thing that you can never imagine happening, because then you just have to guess, which never ever goes well. So make sure that when you're tattooing, you dab the ink first, then you wipe off the excess so that you preserve the stencil throughout the tattoo. Now, I've covered a lot in this video, guys, but there's one thing that I cannot stress enough. Before you start tattooing people, you want to start on a high quality fake skin first, okay? You can shorten the learning curve so dramatically by starting on fake skin before you go on to people. And also, there's no pressure. You can make as many mistakes as you like. You can experiment with different things. You can also tattoo a lot more consistently in the beginning. That said, when you are working with fake skin, it is somewhat harder to tattoo than actual people, which is a good thing. If you can tattoo an awesome piece on fake skin, by the time you get to a person, it's going to be much easier. It's a couple things that you do have to know in order to master fake skin first though. The first thing is getting the stencil on. Now, on a person, the stencil dries very, very quickly, but on fake skin, it takes several hours for the stencil to set. If you start tattooing too soon, you're going to rub that stencil off and the tattoo is going to look terrible. You want to give it at least 4 hours to dry, so you've got a nice, clean, crisp, solid stencil that's not going to rub away when you're tattooing. Also, instead of using stencil stuff like you do on an actual person, it's much better to use like a roll-on deodorant. It won't bleed as much. The stencil will go on dry and it will stay nice and sharp. If you use a stencil stuff, it's too wet, and then the stencil will start to bleed out over the next few hours and will just obscure all the details, and your line work's going to be terrible. When you are putting deodorant over the fake skin, you want to apply a lot of it. You want to go left and right, then up and down. Put the stencil on top. Once the stencil is facing downward, you want to rub the deodorant on the back of the stencil to really get that carbon to stick, and then gradually pull it off. Once the stencil is dry and you do start tattooing, fake skin is more difficult to clean than an actual person's skin. You either have to put a little bit of Glide on the skin, and that will pick up the ink when you wipe it off. You can also use baby oil. The oil will bind with the ink, and then when you go to wipe it off, it comes off really nice and clean. If you just use water or green soap, it's just going to smear over the skin. You're not going to be able to see anything, and you're just going to rip your stencil off, and you're going to have a bad time. Now, Graywash is going to come out a lot darker on fake skin than it is on normal skin, so you need to heavily dilute it. Now, Brandon, if you've seen any of his videos, he likes to mix his own Graywash. I like to use pre-mixed Graywash. So the way that I do it is I'll have black, then I'll have my 20% dynamic Graywash, and then I will have half a cap full of 20% Graywash, and then the last cap, I'll just have 1 to 2 drops of that 20% Graywash, and then I'll dilute them with distilled water. Now, obviously, when you're tattooing an actual person, you don't want to be doing this. This is just for fake skin. If you're using pre-made Graywash, just use it straight out of the bottle. There's no need to further dilute it. It's already diluted enough when you're tattooing actual human skin. I hope this video helped you out. If it did, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more tattooing content just like this to help you move forward in your tattooing career. And if you want some help from me and our team of professional tattoo artists, don't forget to check out the link in the description for our full Artist Accelerator program.